Good morning. I'm so glad to be here. And the effective pronunciation is Appalachia. And you can tell how many generations a family has been in the hills by the way they pronounce that word. You can also tell which part of the hills is their family origins. You get up into New York, you may hear Appalachia. The farther south you go, the wider that drawl gets. Appalachia. And my father said, see, they have to understand certain places in order to know how to say that word. Places like Apalachicola. If you ain't heard of it, you ain't Appalachian. I was listening to Len's story about the stepmother. And my husband and I blended a family together. He had 1, I had 3, we had 4. Within 3 months of us knowing one another, the children were calling us mom and dad. Didn't matter where somebody started, we were mom and dad. As far as that stepmother, stepfather thing, it just means that you may have to take extra steps to help the child to feel comfortable. At least that's the way we thought about it. When we moved into the house where we thought we would be living in Pennsylvania, not knowing my husband was going to be transferred, our youngest 2, because we were blending the family, were only a few months apart, not even a year apart. My baby girl, his only boy. And they didn't get along with one another. Because my daughter was tall for her age and my son was short for his age, so they were about the same size. They both had these round heads and these cute faces. And people thought I had twins. And they would say, oh, your twins are so sweet. And my daughter would look at my son and punch him in the arm. And my son would look at my daughter and say, I hate you. Well, this went on and on and on and on. And we were worried about those 2. But don't mess with either one of them if you were not kin, because they would stand up for one another and then argue with one another later. One time, our son said he was going to run away. He couldn't get his way. Grandma, trying to soothe him because he was a child who'd gone through a divorce, would let him do things he really shouldn't be doing. At the dinner table, Grandma, my husband's mother, would let him put about a pound of sugar on his rice because that's the way he liked to eat it, and I don't want to make him feel bad. And when he had a stomachache later on in the day, he was feeling bad and she couldn't understand why. And he was over there visiting with her, all the children were, and she called me and she said, he just ate an entire box of popsicles all by himself. What do I do? I said, have you ever heard of the phrase, just say no? Well, I don't want to make him feel bad. But when he threw up all over her living room carpet, she kind of got the idea. And she started saying no. And he couldn't get away with that kind of thing in our home. Dad and I had talked about things. We'd stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning talking about personalities and what we could do to help them feel better and get along with one another. And when he decided he was going to run away, his daddy said, all right, but remember, you're not allowed to cross the street. So he went upstairs and packed his little overnight bag, and my daughter was looking at him and looking up at us and looking at him and looking up at us as if we had lost our minds. And he walked toward the door and he glared at us. He was about 2 feet tall. So that glare didn't mean much except I'm angry. And my husband again said, remember, you're not allowed to cross the street. I remember. And out the door he went and he tried to slam that door, but the door was cushioned and it just went shh. And he stomped down the front porch steps, and he started up the sidewalk, and our daughter was looking at him and looking at us and looking at him and looking at us. And finally she said, "What is wrong with you? You're supposed to be the parents." And she stomped out that door, tried to slam that door. She went down those porch steps. She grabbed her brother around his waist. She picked him up. She couldn't carry him high, so he was walking on tiptoes as she tried to carry him back. And she lifted him up on each porch step. And he said, "I'm not." She said, "Shut up." Then she dragged him in that door. And she put him down. And she glared at him nose to nose with him. And she said, "You are not running away. Go to your room." And he went to his room. When they were teenagers, they got into a dumb argument over nothing. That seemed to be their weekend plan every weekend. And it was Sunday. And I was fixing Sunday dinner. Church was over. My husband had to work. And they started arguing again. Now, my husband would always call. He's a really good man. And ask how the day was going. And he could hear them in the background. He said, "I don't even have to ask. Don't tell me what it is." I said, "We have to do something to stop this." And he and I came up with a plan. And when we got off the phone, I called those two to the kitchen table and made them sit down. I put lined paper in front of both of them and a pencil for each one. I said, "Your father and I decided, since you argue over stupid things, we're going to give you something stupid to do. You are each going to write a 3-page report, double-spaced, with correct grammar and spelling and punctuation on the Lawrence Welk Show." You should have seen their cute little round faces. They had to watch the Lawrence Welk Show. Sitting at the table, it was kind of hard for them to see the TV, but you'd see them write. And my son was trying to write as big as he could. And I said, "Now, if you do that, you're going to have to write single-spaced." He brought it down a little bit. And I said, "And every time that you argue like this, you're going to have to do something like this." Well, when my husband came home from work, the house was quiet. Everything was peaceful. They were on the living room floor reading the Sunday paper. He said, "It worked." I said, "I think so." But he had also told me to tell them that he was going to check their papers and approve their papers. Daddy's word would be the final word. And so he was sitting at the kitchen table reading and trying not to laugh. My daughter had written, "All the women have big hair and big puffy dresses, and they sing too much." My son had written, "They sing songs that I don't like. They smile a lot." We kept those reports. And when they were grown, both of them were living in Las Vegas area. My daughter's back in Ohio now. My son married out there and he's living in Nevada. We found a perfect Christmas gift for them in an antique shop. 2 albums of the Lawrence Welk Show. And so for Christmas, we sent each one of them an album with 3 sheets of lined paper and a pencil. And we said, if you ever feel like arguing with one another, you know what you have to do. They are the best of friends, the best of sisters and brothers. I think we gave them a firm foundation. Another story about foundations. Years ago, I was working with a Somalian family organization. The state of Ohio in Columbus had the second largest Somalian population in the United States at that time. And I was helping the young ones with their English language and their writing and their spelling, and also telling stories. And the mothers would come and listen and help if they could. And they would tell me stories in return. One of them was a fantastic storyteller, and I invited her to come to our storytelling group to share stories, and she said, oh no, I couldn't do that. But I give the story to you. You can tell the story. And so I do. She told me that there was a young woman, beautiful and at the age to be able to marry. And she went to the marketplace, and there was a young man, handsome, and he was ready to marry too. And they looked at one another. They were beautiful young people. And immediately they decided to marry. Now, they didn't know one another, but they decided to marry. And the grandmother of one in the family said they should get to know one another first. But both families had some wealth, and the parents thought this is a good idea. We will unite the families. Beautiful children, there will be beautiful grandbabies. And so all the arrangements were made, even though the grandmother objected. And a house was to be built halfway between the families' villages. One lived in one village, one lived in the other. A fine house would be built so that in-laws could come without having to go all the way to either village. Beautiful house being built by the men in both sides of the family. And the grandmother was to come and look over the house and bless the house. And she came slowly, and she walked around the house with those men, and she looked at the house, and she looked at the roof, and she went inside, and she came back out, and she said, this house will not stand. It has no foundation. Well, the men thought, it's got a wonderful foundation. We worked very hard on this house. She's old. She doesn't understand about houses. Then came the wedding, a beautiful celebration. The people from both villages gathering together, celebrating these two young people, beautiful young people, beautiful grandchildren eventually. And they walked with them to that beautiful house. And the grandmother sat on a bench across the road to wait. If these young people needed any advice on marriage, on what to do on the marriage night, she was the one who would give it. She sat there waiting as those young people eventually went into the house and their families went to their villages. Seemed like in no time at all, the young man came back out. With a frown on his face and anger in his voice, she could hear him hissing and fussing. She walked across the street to him and she said, son, what is wrong? He said, I can't stay married to her. She's terrible. Grandmother said, but you just got married. You haven't been in the house that long. What is wrong? He said, well, when we got to the door and removed our shoes to go into our new home, I told her to carry my shoes. And she said to me there was nothing wrong with my hands and I should carry the shoes into the house myself. She is lazy. We got into the house and we were to start the first fire in our hearth. And she told me that the wood that I had gathered for the fire would not burn. I told her that all wood burns, and she told me that it would not burn. And no matter what I said, she said if the wood would not burn. She is argumentative. Then she lit the fire in our hearth. No woman lights the first fire in the hearth, but she lit the fire, and smoke began to rise from that wood. She lit the fire. She is impatient. And when I told her that, she spoke to me in a way no woman has ever spoken to a man in my family. She is rude, lazy, argumentative, impatient, rude. We cannot be married. I am going home to my father and my mother. And he walked out of the house and headed toward his village. Well, the grandmother felt badly for that new bride. They had not even spent a night together. And she got ready to walk into the house to see if she could comfort the bride. But that door opened again and out walked the bride. And she said, I'm going home to my mother and father. And the grandmother asked, what happened? She said, that man has one flaw that will ruin any marriage. Grandmother said, well, he said you had four. Child, what is his single flaw? The young woman said, he's an idiot. When we got to the door and removed our shoes, he expected me to carry his shoes into the house, as if there was something wrong with his hands and arms, and I refused to do it. And he called me lazy. And I just ignored him and went into the house and looked at the wood he had brought for the fire. He gathered green wood, and green wood will smoke, but it will not burn. I tried to tell him that, and when he didn't believe me, I went ahead and lit the wood myself, and the smoke began to rise, and he said I was argumentative. And because I had lit the fire, he said I was impatient. So I talked to him the way my grandmother talked to my grandfather when he got on her last nerve, the way my mother talked to my father when my father got on my mother's last nerve. I spoke to him in the same way, and he had the nerve to say I was rude. He's an idiot. And I am going home to my mother and father. And she walked away, back to her village, back to her family. And those two were no longer married, which meant that the house stood empty. And grandmother looked at it and said, I tried to tell both families that you cannot base a marriage on beauty and wealth. Those children did not know one another. Their marriage had no foundation. But this house, it is built just fine. And because I am the eldest, I can move into a house with a firm foundation. And that is the story that was gifted to me by a Somalian mother several years ago. Besides being a storyteller and writer and a teaching artist, I am also what's known as a breath tech. I help people to get their bodies into an effective position for breathing. That might sound funny, but when we're little, we know how to breathe, and the older we get, the more we're concerned about our looks, and we forget about how important breath is. I'm also a certified laughter yoga teacher, and that's a whole story unto itself. But it was something that I could share with my mother, who's 96 years old and is now in a wheelchair. And as much as I've tried not to have to do it, we had to move her to assisted living. But she could do the laughter exercises from her wheelchair. And the first one I showed her, I'm going to show you. Press your hands together in a gentle clap. And sit like the kings and queens that you are. You're going to clap 2 times and say, ho, ho. But you're going to clap to your left or your other left. It doesn't matter. Ho, ho. Then you're going to clap in the middle 3 times and say, ha, ha, ha. You're going to clap to the other side and say, ho, ho. You're going to clap in the middle 3 times and say, ha, ha, ha. Bring your hands down gently towards your knees. Ho, ho. Bring your hands up with no pain over your head as far as you can. Ha, ha, ha. Then you're going to cheer like Brother Bear from under the belly button area. Wiggle your fingers and say, yay. Ready? Ho, ho. Ha, ha, ha. Big smiles. Ho, ho. Ha, ha, ha. Ho, ho. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah. Well, I taught that to my mother. And I said, how do you feel? She said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. That's a yoga exercise? I said, well, it's called Hasya yoga, laughter yoga. And it also blends into breath yoga. Well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But when I was out of her room, at the time she was living with us, I heard her in there doing another laugh. Very good, very good, very good. Yay! That is the stupidest thing I've ever done. Then she called her friend, Mildred. Let me tell you what Lenny Jean has me doing. And she has the nerve to call it exercise. This is the exercise. Listen to it. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Yeah, isn't that the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your life? And I could hear Mildred laughing on the other end of the phone. Mildred had a big voice she didn't hear very well. Oh yes, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard too, baby. How do you do it? Well, now my mother can't move as effectively. And when I go to visit her, which I'm very grateful that I can do now, every now and then I'll ask her, would you like to do some laughter? She said, oh, honey, you don't have to show me how to do laughter. All I have to do is think about the dumb things you did when you were a child. And I laugh every day. I laugh every day. We didn't necessarily get along when I was a teenager. And when I was a child, I was ornery just enough to work on my mother's last nerve. But now she and I get along very, very well. A love founded on love. It's very good, very good, very good.